Thank you, Dr. Kidula, for that fine presentation. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. King, for your warm introduction. Appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. So I am going to enter this, as you've heard, I am a psychologist, and I do wonder when and where I enter this conversation, so many different ways. So since I'm also a musician, I decided I'd enter in that way. I'm going to highlight some of the things that struck me from what you spoke about at the beginning and toward the end, and I am responding to the paper that I received as well. I studied classical piano for 15 years as a child and in college. And my favorite composers really Beethoven, Chopin. I kind of like the more romantic kinds of things in general. But also played Bach from time to time. And Bach was kind of interesting because I had the opportunity to play Bach on a harpsichord too. My piano teacher had a harpsichord. And it was a very different feel even in playing Bach, tactically on a harpsichord. But also I was struck by the themes and the variations and the way in which he could just think about in his composition, all these permutations and computations. It actually felt mathematical to me and quite joyful and delightful. Now, I mainly played the joyful and delightful pieces. I understand there are other more passionate pieces that he has, but those were the ones that I played. So if you think about that, suppose Bach had always the same theme in all of his compositions. Or if all of the variations were not variations, they were just repetitions. We would call that boring and in certain ways not beautiful. So the diversity in the way that he composes is powerful. Now let's shift. Let's go from Bach to jazz. And if you want to even consider the sacred works of Duke Ellington, I've had the pleasure of performing that and singing as part of that. So even though there's set music that is printed on a page related to that, sheet music for that, the vocals, you actually have room for improvisation. And we had that opportunity to do that. Well, if you think about, suppose in jazz that everybody, all the instruments, repeated the initial flourish in the same way, we would actually call that not jazz. The whole goal is to harmonize, to do a flourish, to do it in style. It's creation at the moment, and in the moment, sometimes late into the early wee hours. So that is beautiful. Now, I recently understood that Bach has some jazz feel in him. So think about that. And then jazz in Bach, Bach in jazz. This is one of the points you're making, that Kagame, that he brings all of these religious influences, different kind of musical influences, and how that is powerful and wonderful. It's a whole different way of maybe thinking about what makes for beauty. So you know that in Simba was Yuda, I'm going to be quoting some of the things that you're saying. It's an apt musical illustration of the anxieties about a polycultural identity in post-colonial Christianized Africa. It brings together different musical styles from different parts of the world and retunes them to fit the Kenyan situation with the hope that they'll also gain global audiences. Now this quartet, if you will, of Rees, I love it. You're highlighting Kagame returns, retunes styles, and resounds, and I almost want to say resounds them, right? Resounds them. and reassembles different musical styles with different associations. So what does that mean? The return to the mother continent, our mother continent, that was then returned in language, structure, and form, and then retuned, reimagined, again, your words here, contextualized in story and style, and then resounded. You also highlight, and this is now more toward the end of your talk, and even as I read this and heard you say this again, it's a profound sadness that Christianity in Africa was about a total and radical denunciation of Africanness. We should forever mourn that that is how it rolled out. And we have all lost something because of that. And beyond the religion, it wasn't just in the church, education, politics, all of those different dimensions. Now, you also mention this liminal space that the artist then maybe occupies in a particular way. The artist brings that anxiety, that pathos, that pain, that suffering, and still is trying to find space, the glory of God in the midst of that, forgiving people in the midst of that, living forward, finding hope in the midst of that. The artist is struggling with all of that. But one way to think about it, a lot of that has to do with suffering. To have taken in Christianity that, yes, included the Word of God, but also a Christianity that had imperialist European colonialism, and then this mixture of jihadist agenda as well as that. So this has been so challenging and has had implications for the universal church. But let's also think about the church here. Now, I'm going to come back to that in one moment, but I want to underscore and make a bridge here to the importance of struggle. The importance of struggle. Some work that we did, which Roberta was a part of that, we asked people about their worship experiences. Happened to be African American, Spanish, Latino folks. We did the interviews in Spanish, Korean Americans, interviews in Korean, and white folks from Presbyterian and Pentecostal backgrounds, right here in Southern California. We asked them about, apart from a conversion experience, when did you feel transformed? And we were looking for behavioral change. When did you walk in church almost one way, and there's this corporate worship we were asking about, and then left a different way? One example, people talked about forgiving, making a decision to forgive based on often what they heard in a sermon. Well, guess what? We asked for the antecedent experience to walking into the church where change happened, a service. It was commonly sadness. Sadness. And almost 40 years ago, Hardy did a similar study, understanding mystical experiences, and he found that sadness was the pre-experience, antecedent state for mystical experiences. So one way we think about that, people bring troubled lives to worship. The question is, in our worship experiences, is there room for that trouble? So popular music has no problem with that. That's the integration. That's my view is that's part of why they're reaching out to both different kinds of religions and different kinds of music, because there's more room for that. Now, in Christian music, we could have more lament, but there's some ways and there's some cultural perspectives that gets moved out and pushed away. One of my students in the book that we have related to this work, Asha Reagan, wrote a chapter on dance, and I love that you were referring to that as well. Thus, for African Americans, worship dance was an evangelizing testimony accusing slave owners. It was also a cry for help to God and a battle cry of his justice that led to healing from brokenness and deliverance from oppression, turning the slaves' mourning into dancing. Their worship dancing was not only an expression of Black souls breaking free, not just breaking, but breaking free, but was also a means of spiritually, relationally, and socially reconfiguring the external imposed boundaries of oppression and restraints. My sisters and brothers, part of what I hear you calling us to is to realize that we need more of a breadth of experience, not only in the Lord's song, but in our churches as well. That's the next step that I take this to, because the songs that are sung in our churches, our spirituality, for some of us, is too much in the dwelling domain and not enough in the challenging and seeking domain. There's a model of spirituality. Sandage and Schultz talk about if you stay in this dwelling place too long, you become stagnant. You must have a balance. And if you stay in seeking all the time, you're not in a stable place. There's a balance. Well, this last night, I was at a church in Houston. I was visiting Fuller Houston, scheduling issue. I wanted to be here, and we won't even get to that, but that's how that worked. Okay, so I was sharing about my research in worship, and the audience was predominantly white. Several of the questions that came up was, why don't we have more of an emphasis on social justice in our church? What do we need to do to incorporate that? Because we do understand that's what our churches should be more about. I said, one option, there's a splitting that I do understand how that happened. One option is to look at the Black church historically, our Latinx churches. There's always been that combination of struggle and addressing injustice and understanding that is what God wants us to be about. Lessons can be learned. Now, do you see the connection from when you strip a people of who they are and their culture? And traditionally, in being African, there's an ability to handle and work with the pain and the joy, the struggle. Music is the most visible expression of that. But other people groups may want to focus more on the peace and the lightness and the not get into that stuff. Some people groups, that's just more their orientation. Well, I, even as an African American, understand that. I was in United Methodist Church. We were having conflict. Consultant came in and said, all right, get together in 4 groups in terms of what you think the church is most about. I don't remember the other 2 groups. I was so involved in evangelism and discipleship. Piety was very important to me. And then there was other group that was involved in civic stuff. I said, I'm not even sure they're Christians. I think they're just people that are coming to the church and they should join a community organization, but they're wanting to make the church like that. That really was where I was at that time. The beautiful thing that happened as a result of that consultation, as I understood more God as a God of justice, I understood that we live in relationship to one another, not only inside this church, but how we live our lives outside, in the community, in the world. God cares about all of that. So, what kind of future does the way in which Kagame engages his work and what you're just saying, how does that then perhaps, what might that mean for us? Returning to our motherland, the true history of Africa, not the distortions, pre-colonial days, linking more with that. I still think Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams is one of the best books that provide some background on that. but returning to the full context of the African experience and reimagining an approach that is fundamentally communal, collectivistic, relational, justice-oriented, honors the land, reveres God, will not only help artists like Kagame, but then resounding it to help the world. And then finally reassembling it to include these neglected dimensions by some of us. That would be a redemptive influence. When we talk about spiritual health, Fisher, we often have an individualistic view of that. Fisher talks about 4 dimensions, the idea of living in harmony with the domains of spiritual well-being. The first is the personal, interpersonal relationships with the self, related to meaning and purpose. The second is communal, the quality and depth of our relationships with other people. The third is environmental, relationships with the physical and human world that include awe and wonder. And the fourth is transcendental, or if you will, transcendent. Relationships with those aspects of life that would include our relationship with God. May we return to the motherland. May we retune. May we resound and reassemble not only the Lord's song, but the Lord's church. Dr. Kidula, thank you for your call.
Mi yeti sheni do